question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
June 30th, 1939 was the largest closing night ever. It was the night the Federal Theater Project died. The question of why America, the richest country in the world, doesn't have a national theater, well, that interests me. I'm Judd Hirsch. I've made my living in theater for as long as I can remember, and I recently discovered that not too long ago, there was something called the Federal Theater. It was the largest theatrical production entity in the history of the world, a national branch of the federal government. It produced 1,200 plays, seen by more than 25 million people, many of whom had never seen a live performance before, all in a brief, brilliant 4 years. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Why? To try to understand its death, I guess a good place to start looking for clues is its birth.
Well, where can you put it? Not just that. The rhythm.
Hello, people. Hello, people. We just a Broadway show.
Through the early part of the 20th century, the theater was the preeminent form of entertainment for Americans. But 20th century technology was about to deliver a knockout combination to the living stage. Punch number one, the movies. Captivating and cheap, you could take the whole family for the price of one theater ticket. Punch number two, radio.
Sergeant McCarthy?
Yes, Your Honor. I mean, Dean Dennis.
Not just cheap, free.
Don't let a kiss go stand here. Don't let your love go wrong. Oh,
With the theater on the ropes, here came punch number three. The Great Depression. Across the country, vaudeville and legitimate theaters shut down. Touring companies of plays folded on the road, stranding the actors thousands of miles from home. From 1929 to 1935, theater people joined the masses of America's unemployed.
Hard Luck Town on the Hudson, for about 200 men who settled in the heart of New York, waiting for a break.
I remember in New York seeing these guys from all over the country. They found fish crates and made houses of it. I remember these guys trying to shave with the salt water of the East River.
As the economic crisis deepened, so did disillusionment and anger. Some Americans lost faith in the capitalist system.
And communism as a solution became much more attractive to many people because the only country in Europe that didn't have bread lines was the Soviet Union.
This country was never more deeply determined to face the solemn tasks before it.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt attacked the Depression by promising Americans a New Deal and putting in his best man, Harry Hopkins. Hopkins, a social worker by training, was accustomed to dealing with the underclasses. His big brainchild was the WPA.
The Works Progress Administration was launched late in 1935 as the key agency in the federal work program to employ able people from relief roles.
But Hopkins realized there was one class of worker the WPA hadn't served.
He used to go down in the evenings in New York City, and he would see men carrying violin cases who were doing this manual work in the parks. And he thought, you know, their hands will be affected by this, and they'll never be able to play again. And we're saving lives in the sense that we're saving people from starving, but we aren't saving talent.
Good luck, bud.
As director of the WPA, Hopkins insisted that it include jobs for artists.
The idea was a wonderful idea, which was to, instead of just giving people a dole, a check once a week for sitting around, they tried to create, Harry Hopkins particularly, tried to create work for them in their chosen profession.
The Arts Project, dubbed Federal One, included separate branches: a writers unit, a visual artists unit, a musicians unit, and a theater unit. Who should head the new theater unit? The theater world buzzed with names. Eva Le Gallienne, famed Broadway actress with her own repertory. Elmer Rice, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Broadway playwright and a director to boot, was interested. Distinguished actor Charles Coburn was mentioned. But Harry Hopkins had a card up his sleeve, a wild card. Hallie Flanagan.
The really remarkable thing is the choice of Hallie to head the theater project.
When Hallie's name was announced for Federal Theater, Broadway went ballistic.
How the hell did he get the notion of putting this amateur woman? It's bad enough that she was a woman, but also she was not a theater professional in the sense that Broadway understood it.
Hallie was a theater person, not a political person, but a theater person. I'm sure her first thought were of the artists.
She was petite. You would never identify her with being in show business. But what you did sense was a great will. Steel.
Hallie. Hallie who? Where did she come from? Hallie Flanagan was director of an experimental theater program, but strictly an academic. In 1926, as one of the first women to receive a Guggenheim Fellowship, Hallie set sail for a whirlwind tour of European and Russian theater. Everywhere she traveled, she learned about contemporary theater. But artistically, the pinnacle of Hallie's journey was Russia.
What they're doing in Russia right now is very exciting. There's Stanislavski, there's Meyerhold, there are agitprop groups, there's impressionism going on, expressionism. In Russia, one of the most important things for Hallie is that she saw a group of workers called the Blue Blouses, and they had started as a group of people who would get up on the stage and read from the newspaper, and a lot of their audience, of course, were illiterate, and so this was a way of disseminating propaganda.
Returning from Europe, her head exploding with ideas about the theater's possibilities, Hallie landed a job at Vassar College. There, in her productions at the college's experimental theater, she applied what she'd learned abroad. Hallie was deep in her work at Vassar when she got a surprise call from Harry Hopkins. He asked her to take the job as director of the Federal Theater Project.
This is non-commercial theater. It's got to be run by a person who isn't interested in just commercial shows. I want someone who knows and cares about other parts of the country. It's a job right down your alley.
Hopkins took Hallie to Iowa in 1935, in July, to announce her as the administrator for Federal Theater. And somebody in the audience said, "Can we really have a Federal Theater that's uncensored?" And Hopkins rolled up his sleeves and he said, "Absolutely, we're going to have a theater that is free, adult, and uncensored."
Free, adult, uncensored. With these words, Harry Hopkins opened Pandora's box.
Well, where did he put it? Not just
We live in a changing world. Man is whispering through space, soaring to the stars and ships, flinging miles of steel and glass into the air. Shall the theater continue to huddle in the confines of a painted box set?
Hallie Flanagan's dream of a national theater was visionary, reaching far beyond her official mandate to put theater people to work. She wanted them working in all entertainment disciplines and in all regions of the country, in productions that would push the theatrical envelope. No audience would be overlooked. There would be Native American units, Mexican American units, Negro units, rural Appalachian units, French, German, Spanish, Yiddish.
I think that was the true greatness, as I see it, of the project, that it recognized the enormous variety of America.
Hallie cared deeply about children. So there would be circuses and puppet shows and performances in the park.
And you pay 10 cents, you pay 15 cents to go in and see a show. Nothing has ever been like that. I think one of the greatest about being able to get children into the theater at an early age, there'll always be a theater-going person, and that's live theater.
In a meticulously constructed plan, Hallie set up a central office in Washington, D.C. It had the power to dictate to the regions, but Hallie preferred not to. She felt that local offices would have a better grasp of local needs and tastes.
I guess what she was an extraordinary woman executive. She could have run the greatest human resources and personnel department in any company.
To run the all-important New York City unit, Hallie was able to enlist the talents of Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Elmer Rice. Not only was he well respected by Broadway, Rice shared Hallie's passion for theatrical experimentation and social commentary. His realistic play, Street Scene, depicted a cross-section of New York's melting pot, trapped in the ruthlessness of life infected by poverty.
Everyone was convinced that he was the person to head the New York theater. Now, he was not a man who was long on patience, and he certainly took very seriously the promise that Hopkins made to Flanagan and to all of these directors initially, that this would be a free, adult, uncensored theater.
Extra, extra, understand going into show business. Read all about it. Extra.
Starting up a nationwide theater turned out to be more difficult than anyone could imagine. Phone calls started flooding in.
Checks are delayed in Illinois. Immediate action needed.
New York is having labor trouble.
Ohio wants to give a benefit for flood sufferers. Bulletin 84 seems to prevent it.
Can the government accept an elephant presented to the circus?
There were forms for everything. You had to sign forms to get a desk. You had to sign forms to get a chair. You had to have signed forms to get a typewriter. The state WPA was, in a lot of places, was very uncooperative. The theatrical people would explain their special situation, and they just didn't give a damn.
At times, it almost seemed as if nobody wanted the Federal Theater to get started.
The League of New York Theaters said, well, we're very sorry, but we don't want you occupying any space anywhere near us. And it was really ironic. I mean, they would say in one hand, well, they aren't going to do anything because they're just relief actors. But on the other hand, don't want any competition.
And everywhere, labor unions set up blockades.
We were getting $23.86 a week. That was not a union salary. For most of the unions, this was a serious threat to their stability as an organization because they had indeed set up contracts in their fields. All of a sudden comes the Federal Theater, which doesn't recognize it. So a big battle ensued.
There was even a union for WPA workers who had no union, the Workers' Alliance, which was said to be controlled by the Communist Party.
Some of the most bitter opposition to the Federal Theater came from the Communist Party. In the beginning, their first attitude was, this is just a way of knocking down wages, this is a nefarious project.
Union problems or no, the Federal Theater held auditions, which wasn't as easy as it sounds. People had to prove that they had earned a living in the theater and were on relief.
And how did you know how many actors there were on relief roles? Well, you didn't know. You had to find out. You had to go through the relief roles, the WPA roles, and find out who was listed, whose occupation was in the theater. Part of the problem was that some of these people had become so desperate and had taken on other jobs in the meantime that they didn't even show up as actors.
Some applicants demonstrated their creativity just qualifying for relief.
I could still live at home in my parents' house. At least I had a roof over my head, but I didn't have any income. And they insisted that you couldn't have a roof over your head at all, even if you had no income. So a friend of mine had a room over in 40-something Street and 8th Avenue. So I moved in there. I had a pair of shoes there and a hat. And they came and the inspector came to see whether I really lived there. He decided I did. So that's how I qualified.
To their absolute dismay, it turned out they couldn't audition. Because the WPA said, we have to get these people on the payroll by a certain time, or our money, you know, we aren't gonna get our money. And if you want them, you've just got to take them.
I was part of Yiddish theater, the Art Tef Theater, and news came and everybody ran to register. I don't remember all the mechanics of how it happened, but you had to go somewhere to say, I'm an actor. And they took you at your word.
Another complication was that many actors felt working for the Federal Theater was a shameful admission their careers had failed.
I met one delegation of actors complaining bitterly because I wanted them to have their names on the programs. One of the women weeping said, "You wouldn't want your name connected with it." "I certainly would," I told her. "And I don't want anyone on Federal Theater who isn't proud to be part of it."
Even the press was an obstacle. Newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst was an outright enemy. The Minneapolis Journal, a Hearst paper, published this photo with the heading, "Federal Fan Dancer #1. The wire services picked it up and blanketed the country. Was the item true? Well, the young woman was a former fan dancer, but not in the Federal Theater. Nevertheless, the Minnesota WPA voted not to have the theater unit. So here's where Hallie was at the end of 6 months. Nowhere. She had a network, but more than half of her regional directors had quit in frustration. She had theaters, but not one play running anywhere.
I think that people all around her were saying all the time, look, you can't have these grandiose dreams. We're never going to get this stuff out of rehearsal.
The Federal Theater desperately needed one thing, a hit, and it had to be in New York City. All eyes focused on the New York unit, which was creating an entirely new form of theater, the living newspaper.
The one big invention of the theater in our time, which was the living newspaper. This was a real invention.
The March of Time.
I think the thing that's easiest to compare it to were the old newsreels. So you would have all of these film clips with a voiceover explaining all of these events that were going on in the United States and around the world.
Basically, it was the dramatization of an issue. It could be about any social public issue. And they found a way of combining dramatic scenes with the use of photographs in a crude way of blowing them up at that time. It was also novel in the sense that no one writer wrote them. They were written really by a group. The way movies were written.
The living newspaper unit ran like the office of a city daily, with editors, reporters, and copyreaders. Elmer Rice hired Morris Watson, former head of the Newspaper Guild, as the managing editor. Watson hired Arthur Arendt as writer and Joe Losey as director. Their first production, the show on which Halley and Rice pinned their hopes, focused on the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the failure of the League of Nations to intervene, and the clash of wills between Emperor Haile Selassie and dictator Benito Mussolini.
David, remember that Haile Selassie is a very educated man, and he speaks very quietly and very sincerely. Now let me hear you read that speech, please.
I say it is far better to die on the field of battle a free man than to live as a slave.
At the Biltmore Theater, the dress rehearsal looked something like this.
The drums of war beat out, and the barbaric natives rally to the King of Kings.
As a sovereign state, recognized by the League of Nations, ours is the right to do anything we please within our own territory, of which Walwal is a part. We intend to follow the example of our fathers in safeguarding this territory. To this end, I saw that it is better to die on the battlefield than live as a slave.
Mussolini had roared that it was Italy's fascist duty to civilize these backward savages who own slaves. Against the spears of Selassie's cavalry, the Roman legions brought the civilizing influence of armor plate, flamethrowers, high explosives, and mustard gas.
Italy can and will provide a whole library of photographs and documents bearing out our claim against Ethiopia. But the accelerated pace of Ethiopian military preparations renders it necessary for us to proceed with further measures of military character. Italy is for peace. I am for peace. But what I have started, I will finish.
Now, you're the only audience to ever see any portion of this play. The Federal Theater's production of Ethiopia closed before it had a chance to open. As a courtesy, the play, all fact-checked, was sent to the White House for permission to use a Roosevelt quote. A reply came, not from the White House, but from the State Department, via Jacob Baker of the WPA.
This will direct that no issue of the living newspaper shall contain any representation of the head or one of the ministers or the cabinet of a foreign state unless such representation shall have been approved in advance by the Department of State.
Halley appealed to both Harry Hopkins and Eleanor Roosevelt to intercede. They wouldn't. Halley and Rice flew to Washington to confront Jacob Baker.
Rice to Jacob Baker was a troublemaker. Rice was somebody who wanted to do things that no one, certainly in the Federal Theater administrative hierarchy, wanted to have done.
Rice was eloquent, but firm. At the meeting, he threatened to quit. Baker responded by taking a pre-typed letter out of a desk drawer accepting Rice's resignation. It was as if lines from the play itself mirrored Rice's own thoughts. Rice went straight to the press.
This show has been stopped by the Works Progress Administration on the ridiculous ground that the portrayal of living statesmen might cause international complications. To present the Italo-Ethiopian War without Mussolini and Haile Selassie would be like presenting Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. The issue is clearly one of free speech.
So there you have it. Hopkins' promise of a free, adult, uncensored theater ended in a clash between Rice and Baker over Ethiopia. It was the Federal Theater's first significant battle over censorship, but it would not be the last.
Certainly put it. Not just Mr. Withers.
Winter 1936. The Federal Theater's outlook was bleak. Where was that elusive first hit? Well, it would come not from Midtown, but Uptown. In the 30s, segregation was rampant in America. However, for many black musicians, singers, and dancers, show business was a road to success. For actors, though, the opportunities were fewer, and the roles offered tended to be one-dimensional, stereotypical.
How come I'm listening to it on the radio?
There was no theater for black actors. They had no place to work. They might work in a small theater in the community after work for free. No kind of income whatsoever, you know. And then along came this Roosevelt and Work Progress Administration, and they set up this Negro unit of the Federal Theater.
There were 16 units, Negro units across the country, and they were to be directed by black people.
Rose McClendon, a well-known black actress, was initially selected to run the Harlem unit. At the first meeting of the Negro unit, she asked for help.
I was appointed co-director with Rose McClendon. She had very advanced cancer, and she really had very little opportunity to do anything with the theater. So I remained in sole charge of the Negro unit. One half of the theater was devoted to indigenous shows. We did shows written by black authors, directed by black directors, entirely played by blacks, and preferably on contemporary black subjects. And then the other half, I decided we would do classics. Regardless of color, regardless of anything, we'd simply do the classics. And if you say you're going to do the classics, what you're really saying is you're going to do Shakespeare. And then the problem was to find a director, because there were no black directors who'd had the experience or the chance ever to work in the classics. So, and I didn't want an Englishman, I didn't want them all talking in Oxford accents, so I bethought me of this brilliant young man whom I was sort of already in partnership with at the time, but we never had enough money to produce anything.
And he brought in the younger Orson Welles, who, in a sense, was sort of a prophecy because the guy was a genius. At 21 or 22, I mean, he did things that I don't think any other producer, director, black or white, had ever done up until that point.
He had the best attitude when he directed. And he would say, listen, sugar, hey, honey bun, always start out with something to weaken you inside, warm and lovely. And then he'd say, listen, hon, you know what you just said? And you know the way you said it? Were you angry? Well, that line is, it's not an angry line, is it? Well, how would you say that if you were saying that from your heart to somebody that you love? It helped you to really get the feeling of what would be going on inside of you.
What Orson brought was a totality, the sound, the lighting, the music, the overwhelming sense of being enveloped in the production as audience. And he was the first American to do that.
For their first production with the Negro unit, Houseman and Wells selected Macbeth. Why Macbeth?
Orson thought up the idea of doing Macbeth and laying it in the Caribbean.
My name's Macbeth.
And immediately the parallel between Macbeth, Scotland in the 13th century, and the history of Christophe in Haiti, which was again the rise of a soldier who becomes a dictator and finally ends in a bloodbath. That seemed a very interesting and close parallel.
No venom would be come to Dunsinane, yet I will try the land. I have no land. Lay on, Macduff, and damn be he who first cries, hold enough. Thou losest labor, I bear a charmed life which must not yield to one of woman born.
Spare thy charm, and let the angel whom thou still hast served tell thee Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped.
Of course it be the tongue that tells me so. And be these juggling fiends no more believed.
Finally, the Federal Theater had its first critical hit.
Ship the witches into the dank and fever-stricken jungle. Stuff a gleaming naked witch doctor into the cauldron. Hold up Negro masks in the baleful light. And there you have a witch's scene that is logical and stunning and a triumph of the theater art.
In terms of the audience, it was the first time that audiences from downtown came uptown, and audiences from uptown said, oh, there's something happening over at the Lafayette that we want to know about, and it's about us.
The only truly unremittingly bad review of Macbeth came from Percy Hammond of the Herald Tribune.
The Negro Theater, an offshoot of the federal government and one of Uncle Sam's experimental philanthropies, gave us last night an exhibition of deluxe boondoggling at the Lafayette in Harlem.
Percy Hammond wrote a perfectly awful review saying this was a disgrace, that money was being spent putting these people who couldn't even speak English and didn't know how to do anything. And it was a dreadful review, but purely a political review. And we had, in the cast of Macbeth, about 12 voodoo drummers and one magic man, a medicine man, who used to have convulsions on the stage every night. And they decided that this was a very evil act by Mr. Hammond, and they came to Orson and me, and they showed the review, and they said, this is bad man. And we said, yeah, a hell of a bad man. Sure, he's a bad man. And the next day, the theater manager said, I don't know how to tell you this, but there was some very strange goings-on last night. There was, after the show, they stayed in the theater, and there was drumming and chanting and stuff. And we said, oh, really? And what made it interesting was the fact that we just read the afternoon papers. Percy Hammond had just been taken to the hospital with an acute attack of something from which he died a few days later.
The most significant thing about the Federal Theater, particularly the Harlem section of it, was that it gave, for the first time in the history of the American theater, black technicians an opportunity to get experience, and it broke the anti-black stronghold that the stage-hand union had.
Meanwhile, the other half of the Negro unit was doing indigenous plays. Notable among them was Rudolph Fisher's adaptation of his own novel.
Conjure Man Dies is, there's a doctor, and he went to Harvard University. He got out and came back to Harlem to practice medicine. Of course, no one would go to a black doctor, so he had no way of making a living. And so he was out of Nigeria, Ghana, and he said, oh, okay, I'll practice a certain kind of voodoo. I'll become a conjure man.
Thank you. It is I who must thank you.
Thank me?
For persuading Sergeant Dart to have the whole company reassemble here tonight.
My motives hardly deserve thanks.
I think I understand your motive. You didn't understand how an African savage could acquire an education and turn it into charlatanism.
That I could understand, but you're not a savage, and this isn't charlatanism.
Few of the people who could have done so have bothered to notice that.
In our mystery play, the conjure man is killed. And so two Harlem detectives set out to find out how he was killed and who killed him.
Conjure Man Dies is many consider it to be the first African-American detective novel. And so this is the first time we've seen this character. Fisher created this character.
I thought you were smart. Didn't it ever occur to you that we might have reasons for letting you birds fly around? Well, we know every move you make.
And do nothing about it.
Plenty. We let you birds fly around till you're right where we want you. Putting you guys away for a few months does no good. Your kind has to be put out of circulation forever. let you alone, and sooner or later you ask for it. That's what you've done now.
And it's the music of the period, you know, the whole jazz age is resurfacing. Without question, they broke down so many stereotypes because black people were in charge of doing these plays.
When Wells and Houseman left, the Harlem unit was a thriving theater company that would bring black and white audiences to Harlem for the next few years. It was now time for the Living newspaper to play out its role in the life and death of the Federal Theater.
May 1st, Midwest Weather Report.
Fair and warmer.
May 2nd, Midwest Weather Report.
Fair and warmer.
In 1936, a Living newspaper finally opened in New York City.
Fair and warmer.
It was called AAA Plowed Under.
Fair and warmer. Dust!
Like all the Living newspapers, it examined a current national issue.
The agricultural program of the Roosevelt administration is steadily destructive of agriculture's opportunities.
AAA was controversial. It attacked the Supreme Court and defended Roosevelt's agriculture programs. And the form that Morris Watson and Joe Losey gave it made Halley very nervous.
3 or 4 days, 5 days, 2 days, I don't know. Before we were supposed to open, Halley Flanagan came to see it with Philip Barber, who had replaced Elmer Rice because Elmer Rice had resigned. And they came to see it and they said, absolutely not, this production cannot open. And fortunately, Morris Watson, Arthur Aron, and I made absolutely common cause with each other, and we said to Halley Flanagan, either you open this production as we have done it on the night that it is scheduled to open, or we all resign together and finish. And this frightened her and frightened Barbara, and so we opened it.
AAA Plowed Under was a hit, and though Halley may have mistrusted the content, she loved the form. Out of the often painful collaboration had evolved the Living newspaper's distinctive signature style: area lighting, modular sets, and projections. Norman Lloyd was in the cast of the next Living newspaper, Injunction Granted.
It was the history of labor in the courts. That's hardly something to bring an audience in.
What attracted Morris Watson to the topic of labor and the courts? A former official of the Newspaper Guild, he was still smoldering over a recently failed strike, which he believed the union would have won had the courts not been biased.
The case of Dean S. Jennings, newspaper man.
Ladies and gentlemen, a fight to the finish. In this corner, Dean Jennings, the pride of the Newspaper Guild, A.O.
Injunction Granted ridiculed the anti-guild publishers.
And in this corner, the champion of the Non-Collective Bargaining Athletic Association, William Randolph Hearst.
Both men are in the pink, folks, raring to go. They can't seem to wait for the bell. And there they go. Hearst tries a left, but he misses. Jennings tries an uppercut to his face, but he misses. Hearst leads with his chin. Jennings lets go with an uppercut. He socks him. He's down. Here comes the decision, folks. We'll know in just a moment.
Injunction Granted may have had a sense of humor, but Halley was not amused.
The production seems to me special pleading, biased, an editorial, not a news issue.
Again, the opening was postponed, never quite banned. And finally, it came to a showdown. And then again, we won, and again, it opened.
The fact that Injunction Granted was a hit, drawing big enthusiastic audiences, did not mollify Hallie Flanagan. For one thing, the armies of the political left had not failed to notice the play's bias. The unions were sending members to see injunction granted. And uninvited guests were openly distributing leftist literature in the lobby. Though Hallie banned the pamphleteering, the Federal Theater started to look like it was promoting revolution. One more reason for Hallie to be furious with Watson and Losey.
Morris, as I have repeatedly said, I will not have the Federal Theater used politically. I took your word and Joe Losey's word that it would not be so used, and I think you both let me down.
It didn't have much chance, and the spirit was gone, and it didn't do as well as the other, although it was more interesting, I think, by far. And it closed. Then I presented various other projects. All of them were turned down, so I resigned. As simple as that.
Watson remained. For the next living newspaper, he promised a less controversial topic. He didn't deliver.
I don't get this. I don't get this at all.
What's on your mind now?
If the electric companies around here are showing the biggest increases in their history, what are they complaining about?
They claim the government has no right to go into the power business.
Even if it does the companies good and their stocks go up?
Even if it does the company...
That's not the point. We object because it's interfering with private initiative, competing with private industry. And it's not the American way. Furthermore, it's unconstitutional.
Power. I created this character, Angus K. Button Cooper, the quintessential consumer. And the first scene I had was a very typical living newspaper scene. And the set was actually a projection. And I'm going shopping.
How much are your potatoes?
15 pounds for a quarter.
Oh, that's too high. I'll go someplace else. How much are your potatoes?
20 pounds for a quarter.
Fine. I'll take them. How much you charging me for electricity?
17 cents a kilowatt hour.
Oh, too high. I'll go someplace else. Where's the other fella?
There is no other fella.
You mean you're the only one selling electricity in this city?
That's right.
And if I don't get it from you, I gotta do without.
That's right. Would you like us to discontinue service?
No.
Was there a way to help consumer Angus Button Cooper? Was there a way to make power prices respond to market forces?
The Tennessee Valley Authority is created for the purpose of 1, flood control of the Tennessee River Basin, 2, elimination of soil erosion, and 3, the social and economic rehabilitation of the swampland and hill people of this district. 4, the generation and distribution of cheap electric power and the establishment of a cost yardstick.
My name is William Edwards. I live down Cold Creek Way. I'm working on the project they call the TVA. The government begun it when I was but a child, and now they are in earnest, and Tennessee's gone wild. All up and down the valley, they heard the glad alarm. The government means business, it's working like a charm. Oh, see them boys are coming, their government they trust. Just hear their hammers ringing, they'll build that dam or bust. For things are surely moving down here in Tennessee. Good times for all the valley, for Sally and me. For things are surely moving down here in Tennessee. Good times for all the valley, for Sally and me.
Power played all over the country, igniting sparks wherever it opened. Harry Hopkins put his personal stamp of approval on Power by attending the New York opening and making an impromptu speech to the cast.
This is a great show. It makes you laugh and it makes you cry. I want this play and plays like it done from one end of the country to the other. Now let's get one thing clear. You will take a lot of criticism on this play. People will say it's propaganda. Well, I say, what of it? I say more plays like Power, and more power to you.
Now is the way clear. Now is the meaning plain. Temptation shall not in this kind again. The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason.
It was the sort of play no other American producer would have touched. A verse drama on a religious subject. And in 1936, Murder in the Cathedral proved once more that the Federal Theater could achieve critical success. More proof soon followed. On October 27, 1936, another Federal Theater opening, like none ever seen before or since.
They did that production of Sinclair Lewis's book, It Can't Happen Here, which was a book that imagined what would happen if fascism came to America.
Here in the United States, the German-American Bund openly imitates the strut and slogans of the Nazi stormtroops.
Which, of course, was the thesis of Lewis's novel. It could happen here. When the Federal Theater approached Lewis with an offer, the novelist grabbed it with both hands. Writer Studs Terkel played the fascist policeman, Shad Ledoux.
I remember in It Can't Happen Here, I have a uniform, like the silver shirts was moving back then. I have the uniform on suddenly instead of my overalls. And by God, what a feeling, looking out, in charge. I was in power.
It wouldn't just open in one theater, not even one city. It wouldn't just be performed in English. There would be productions in Yiddish, Spanish, French, and German. The job was 1 part heroism, 9 parts pain.
But they did it. They were, rewriting those scripts. Lewis was in a hotel room rewriting, and the rewrites would go out all over the country. Change this, change that.
Halley was flooded with telegrams. Chicago, Act 3 Lewis play does not make sense. Stop.
Tampa, Spanish company restive. Stop. Los Angeles, making superhuman efforts to meet October 27 Lewis play. Stop. Imperative, have no more revisions.
Stop. Stop. 2 days before the opening, Lewis decided he hated the sets. And Halley herself got into the act.
With the assistance of a few devoted stagehands, we started in to rearrange, repaint, and redress the sets.
2 nights later, the play opened on schedule.
We're having a book burning on the green tomorrow night. A what? Gonna burn up all this subversive literature. A lot of smutty stuff that's corrupting public morals. Have you got any objections? Well, you won't find any subversive books here. Oh. Now, how about this fella? Now, this fella, Charles Dickens, wasn't he a communist?
All told, 22 theaters in 18 cities opened on the same night, each with its own version of the play. Telegrams poured in from across the country saying that large, appreciative crowds had shown up at all the theaters. That night, 22 acting companies waited up late for the reviews. In 3 months, the play was seen by 500,000 people, the equivalent of a 5-year run on Broadway. Meanwhile, Orson Welles and John Houseman had moved to Broadway and launched a new Federal Theater project at the Maxine Elliott's Theater on 39th Street, Project 891. Their first play was Horse Eats Hat, a loose adaptation of a 19th century French farce. Welles and Houseman assembled a first-rate acting troupe, many of whom went on to become stars for life, including Joseph Cotten, Arlene Francis, and Martin Gable. And the behind-the-scenes team had the composer Paul Bowles and the father of American stage lighting, Abe Fader. Next up for Project 891 was Christopher Marlowe's classic, The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus. For this one, Wells wore many hats. He wore the star's hat. He wore the director's hat. He even wore the hat of the man who designed the hats.
Faustus was just brilliant. You know, Orson was a magician, and he loved to do magic. And Faustus gave him that opportunity, because you had trap doors, you had lights, people appearing, disappearing, you had smoke, you had all the things a magician would use to mystify you. And the play even served Orson a bit as an actor, because it is big, sort of pompous in a way. And, you know, Orson could do that.
The limited run scheduled for Faustus was quickly extended, filling the Maxine Elliots from January to June of 1937, when it was replaced by, well, actually, it wasn't replaced. In early 1937, a young composer named Mark Blitzstein went from living room to living room in Manhattan with the score of a musical he hoped to get produced, playing and singing his material for potential backers.
Maybe you wonder what it is makes
Blitzstein defined it as a labor opera. For months, Blitzstein found no takers, until one day his audience included Hallie Flanagan. She grabbed the piece for the Federal Theater, turning it over to Orson Welles and John Houseman for Project 891. It was called
Somebody may have spotted me and said, that's a good guy for a labor organizer. But the next thing I knew, Houseman called, invited me down to Blitzstein's place on 12th Street. He had that place for so long. And there was Houseman, Blitzstein, and Orson. Big seduction scene. Mark played some of Cradle, had me singing before I knew that I could sing. Had me singing the song. Wow. And they all said that nobody else in the wide world could possibly play Larry Foreman. And it wasn't until I had agreed to be in it and walked downstairs and crossed Fifth Avenue, because I lived in the Village too. I was about 3 blocks away that I suddenly realized that my pay as a radio director was $33, and the pay for an actor was $23.86 a week, and that I had willingly, as a labor organizer in the new Cradle of Rock, dropped $10 a week.
Talk it over. Outside. Wait. I'm kind of funny that way.
By the middle of May, rumors flew that there would be drastic budget cuts in the WPA. Led by the Workers' Alliance on May 27, 7,000 of the 9,000 WPA relief employees went to demonstrations instead of to work. All the federal theater projects were dark that night, all on the strength of a rumor. Well, it wasn't just a rumor. On June 10 came the order from Washington. Cut the budget by 30%. On June 12th, the WPA made an even more alarming move.
Because of the cuts and reorganization, no new musical performance will be allowed to open before July 1.
Only one federal theater play was scheduled to open before July 1st. The Cradle Will Rock. Coincidence?
This was obviously censorship under a different guise.
Censorship? Of what? A musical? Well, for its time, Cradle Will Rock was quite incendiary. But probably the biggest reason the WPA feared Cradle was the play's open endorsement of labor unions.
You're caught here, boys. You're stuck like a sandwich between the top crowd pressing down and the bottom crowd coming up. What do you want to be? Hamburgers, I ask you.
Larry is the organizer, the labor organizer, who's been pulled in with prostitutes and with street people and so on in a cleanup of the town, along with the powers that be, Mr. Mister and the rest, and who, when the Moll, the whore, asks him what he's doing here, he says, "Who, me?" Making why he was pulled in. He says, "Who, me?" Making a speech and passing out leaflets. The formal charge is inciting to riot. Ain't you ever seen my act? When I'm creeping along in the dark, my eyes is crafty, my pockets is bulging. I'm loaded, armed to the teeth with leaflets. And am I quick on the draw? I come up to you very slow, very snaky, and with one fell gesture, I tuck a leaf in your hand. Then 1, 2, 3.
There's a riot. Oh,
You're the riots. I incited you. I'm terrific, I am.
No, I don't want.
In 1937, those were fighting words.
And I don't want your diamond ring. All I want is the right to work, mister.
The country had just lived through several brutal, debilitating strikes.
By the Congress of the Industrial Organization.
In 1937, in Chicago, CIO was being organized. Mine workers, auto workers, rubber workers, farm equipment were all organized. The Steel Workers Union was Steel Workers of America. Big Steel finally accepted the union. Republic Steel said, no, we'll never recognize the union. Chicago had a big Republic Steel plant on the south side. Memorial Day in 1937, the strikers said they're going to hold a picnic on those grounds. And they did. There was fried chicken, potato salad, women, kids, songs, baseball, and there were some cops there, Chicago cops, waiting for some riot to happen. Nothing was happening. Someone threw a stone on up again. Cops started shooting. Shot 10 guys in the back, and they killed those 10 guys. That became known as the Republic Steel Massacre.
Hallie Flanagan had no way of knowing that by the time we were ready to produce it, there'd be an enormous industrial conflicts all over the country, and there were reasons why the WPA was embarrassed at producing that play, which we ignored and pretended that we didn't understand, but we did understand perfectly.
In their entire professional association, before and after Cradle, Houseman and Wells never opened a production on schedule. But this time, they weren't going to let the WPA tell them what to do. They assured the press that the Cradle would rock, as promised, on June 16th. If not under the auspices of the Federal Theater, then under their own banner.
The government clamped down on it, refused to have it open. And Howard Da Silva and Hiram Sherman and the rest of us had our wigs and costumes snatched away from us. The sets were removed. The theater was padlocked, and the audience itself was there for a preview, was thrown out into the street.
There was this usual milling crowd that you find outside the theater 2 or 3 minutes before the curtain's about to go up, and everybody scurries in and watches the play. But here we were at this play that was the opening night of Cradle Will Rock, and nobody was scurrying in anywhere.
John Houseman and some very enterprising people like Archibald MacLeish went out to get a theater. And we went out in front, entertained the audience with little snatches of songs and everything I ever knew, from Walt Whitman on through, until they came by in a fire truck. And Mark Bitson had a piano, and the fire people were helping, and they announced they had a theater 20 blocks away, up by the Central Park.
An impromptu parade was organized, and I can see somebody standing on the sidewalk in Times Square watching this parade go by. At the head was a truck, and sitting on a piano stool was Mark Blitzstein. And he was playing songs from the show, and the marchers, or march of the audience, was marching about 5 abreast up 7th Avenue. And people looking at this wondered, what the hell is going on here? They'd never seen a promotional stunt like this connected with the theater.
Houseman and Wells had one more serious problem to overcome. The unions had forbidden any member of the cast to perform on the stage.
And on the stage, Orson Welles gave a speech. Archibald MacLeish made a nice speech. And John Houseman talked. And Mark came out, they wheeled the piano out with the fireman, and he sat down the piano and began to play it as he did at auditions. And as he got to this first song, the little girl, a Catholic girl, and quite reactionary on most subjects, got up suddenly in the box and began to sing. And as we came to each one of the parts, the lawyers and the doctors, Mr. Mister, Mrs. Mister, Junior Mister, and all of them, We all stood up in whatever part of the auditorium we were. We followed the lead of this little girl and sang our songs. And it was a tremendous success.
Years later, a member of the cast said that if Olive Stanton had not risen on cue, he doubted whether the rest of the cast would have had the nerve to stand up and carry on. Now, the day after the opening of Cradle, Wells and Hausman were fired by the Federal Theater Project for insubordination. They immediately formed the Mercury Theater, whose first production was
The Cradle Will Rock!
In July 1937, the new fiscal year began. So did summer. And despite the uproar over The Cradle Will Rock, despite the budget cuts and merciless downsizing, the Federal Theater entered the summer with a surge of optimism. A surge that took it outdoors. In North Carolina, the Federal Theater presented an outdoor historical pageant, recreating events in roughly the same spot where they had originally occurred. You can measure the play's success by the length of its run. It's still running. Every summer, Roanoke Island revives the Lost Colony. And you didn't have to live in the country to enjoy the Federal Theater outdoors. The New York unit had 5 specially designed trucks that would unfold magically into theaters. In a park, on a street corner. Usually the play was for children. The Emperor's New Clothes or Jack and the Beanstalk. It was the kind of event that can happen only in the summer, part show, part picnic. A Depression family could be amused for an entire afternoon for free. There were even circuses.
They got a big tent together, and there were no animal acts, but there were different acts. We did what they call a flying ladder act. There were 5 girls around the ring, and a young man was attached to each girl. So the fellows would put their hands around our waist and hoist us up. We were special. We were big time.
Some of the most creative thinking in the Federal Theater units involved figuring out how to use unemployed vaudeville performers. Their talents were welcome in the Children's Theater unit, under the directorship of the dynamic Yasha Frank. It was Frank who made the most interesting use of the old vaudevillians anywhere in the Federal Theater. For his adaptation of Hansel and Gretel, he brought 60 vaudevillians together. His next production, Pinocchio, was an even greater triumph and transferred to New York for a long and successful run.
My favorite instrument is the fife.
One of the most dazzling children's shows ever put on by the Federal Theater was a fable about a hard-working group of beavers that straightens things out with their selfish chief in a far-off place called Beaverland.
We had children hopping on stage and straightening out the actors the way they should go. And we had all kinds of wonderful things on stage, mills and straps and...
Revolt of the Beavers, the play, became known as the weapon that destroyed Federal Theater.
If you ask us why we're giving our attention to the bark, well, that's how beavers have made their living since the day they left the ark.
When the beavers build their houses, it's the bark they've got to use. And the same applies to trousers. Ditto, for the shoes.
So, we strip, and we clip, and we stack, and we pack, and we clip it, and we stack it, and we pack it. And we work. No play, work all day, work.
But the chief of all the beavers, he takes all the bark we make. All he does is pull the levers while we work until we ache.
While we work until we ache.
We admit it was propagandistic. We were trying to sell the fact that these are working people who work their asses off all their lives. Basically, that's it.
And we strip it, and we clip it, and we stack it, and we pack it, and we work. Work.
2 years, the Federal Theater's staunchest friend in the press was Brooks Atkinson of the New York Times. But his review of Beavers was not friendly.
Mother Goose is no longer a rhymed escapist. She has been studying Marx.
Halley rejected the thought that the play was disseminating Marxism.
An audience survey by trained psychologists brought only favorable reactions from children, such as, teaches us never to be selfish. It is better to be good than bad.
But it's hard to deny what that message was. The cast members certainly knew.
It said, in effect, that the rich people have all the power and the poor people should take that power away from them. What could be more radical?
A brouhaha started that this was communist propaganda, which in a way I suppose it was. But I don't think it converted anybody to anything.
Nonetheless, because of the brouhaha, the Beavers' New York run was shortened to 2 weeks, and its repercussions went on for years. The living newspaper, 1/3 of a nation, a devastating attack on slum housing in America, was New York's last controversial production before political pressure caused WPA officials to step in to clean up the New York unit. Philip Barber, who had replaced Elmer Rice, was himself replaced with a more conventional producer. Under new management, New York prepared a nice, safe show, Sing for Your Supper. A musical review, it couldn't offend anyone. It also couldn't open. Sketches were dumped and replaced. So were actors. Rehearsals dragged on for 14 months. Luckily, just as New York started to wither, Chicago burst into bloom.
Can you sing and sing? If you can, it's a well-established fact that Uncle Sam will take you in, break you in, make you into anything you could desire. Uncle Sam, he wants to hire actors with dramatic fire, singers who's too famous fire.
Oh, Say Can You Sing was a wicked biting of the hand that fed it.
Why we all inspire. Say, can you sing, dance or act?
Chicago created its own living newspaper, the only unit outside of New York to do so. And on a very daring topic, Sparrow Keats was about syphilis, a word seldom spoken aloud in 1938 polite society. The Chicago Tribune called the play a valuable contribution to anti-syphilis propaganda. Chicago also made dance an integral part of the Federal Theater, building on work begun in New York by Helen Tamiris, Charles Whiteman, and Jose Limon. Chicago stars included Ruth Page, Grace and Kurt Graff, and the great African-American dancer and choreographer Katherine Dunham, who brought black folk dances to the concert stage.
Agia was the name of a fighting dance in Martinique. And I did a little story that went with it, and then the ballet. And it gave me an opportunity to stage and clothe John Pratt's costumes and present a full ballet. I would never in the world have been able to do that, you know. It cost, for me, it would have been impossible. So that I'm forever grateful to the WPA for allowing me to do this ballet, which was very successful and which stayed with our repertoire for years and years.
With all this dance talent in Chicago, particularly in the Negro unit, people began to get ideas.
I was in Peoria with my project, and Harry Minturn came down and says, Al, I got to talk to you. We had a black group here, black actors and actresses, and they didn't do anything. This was in Chicago. So he said, I've got an idea. I want to run it by you. What do you think of this?
The idea was ingenious, tailoring a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta to a large all-black cast. Gilbert's lyrics were massaged. Sullivan's music was given a jazz beat.
So they decided to call it the Swing Mikado.
Swing Mikado was a runaway hit in Chicago, so the unit decided to go for broke, move the play to New York. Broadway producer Mike Todd offered to take it over, but without the Chicago cast. Halley refused, and Todd opened his own version, Hot Mikado. For a while, both versions ran simultaneously. As had happened with The Cradle Will Rock, a private producer got rich off a federal theater idea without so much as a thank you. By 1938, more than 25 million Americans had seen productions mounted by the Federal Theater. But in Washington, there arose a man who, though he hadn't seen the Federal Theater's work, had strong opinions about it. Meet Representative Martin Dies.
Them before they strike.
The basic principles of Americanism. That's not the question. The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It was Martin Dies who spearheaded the newly formed House Special Committee to investigate un-American activities.
The reason the Dies Committee developed in the first place had to do with really developments abroad and the rise of fascism in Europe, and the fact that there were fascist and communist sympathizers in the United States.
If columnists are working in our national defense industries for the purpose of sabotaging our preparedness program, our committee is the only agency of government that has the power of exposure.
I remember a rather stupid man, a real Philistine, who had no grasp at all of what wonderful thing was growing in the American culture. And he saw the red under every bed and under every dressing room and every backstage. And he said, this is destructive, it must go.
In 1938, there were many anti-New Dealers who thought that the Great Depression had been caused not by rampant greed and an unregulated stock market, but by an international communist conspiracy attempting to undermine our economy and government. And where would the committee's search for subversion begin? Committee member J. Parnell Thomas told the press.
It is apparent from the startling evidence received thus far that the Federal Theater Project not only is serving as a branch of the communistic organization, but is also one more link in the vast and unparalleled New Deal propaganda machine.
Significantly, Halley did not learn of the charges from the WPA. She got the scoop from the newspapers and released an immediate and unequivocal denial.
I have never seen such notices.
But to her surprise, the WPA told her she had broken a rule by talking to reporters. Henceforth, only the WPA Information Office would deal with the press. The only thing Halley could do was to testify at those hearings.
My name is Halley Flanagan. I am National Director of the Federal Theater Project.
The first round of questions came from Congressman Joseph Starnes.
Mrs. Flanagan, the charge has been made that some of the plays that were put out by the Federal Theater Project are propagandistic. Is that true or untrue?
To the best of my knowledge, we have never done a play which was propaganda for communism. But we have done plays which were propaganda for democracy, propaganda for better housing.
How about Power?
Yes, I would say that Power was propaganda for a better understanding of the derivation and the scientific meaning of power and for its wide use.
Was it for public ownership of power?
That portrayed as effectively as possible both sides of that controversy and quoted both sides.
Searching for a tip-off that Halley was a communist, Starnes focused on the Russian leg of her Guggenheim trip to Europe.
Did you or not make the statement that the theaters in Russia are more vital and important?
Yes, I did find that. The Russians have had a long and an exciting history of theatrical development.
This is your language that I am quoting. The workers' theaters intend to remake a social structure without the help of money. And this ambition alone invests their undertaking with a certain Marlowe-esque madness. You are quoting from this Marlowe. Is he a communist?
I am very sorry. I was quoting from Christopher Marlowe.
Tell us who Marlowe is so we can get the proper reference, because that is all we want to do.
Put in the record that he was the greatest dramatist in the period of Shakespeare, immediately preceding Shakespeare.
Starnes discreetly decided he had no further questions. Soon after, Martin Dies himself took up the questioning.
You have established the precedent of exhibiting a play championing the cause of ownership of public utilities. You said that was proper, and you yourself thought you had a right to do that?
I think so.
And that implication of her politics, that was Hallie's crime. She was no communist, but she was liberal enough for Dies to consider her virtually communist. On January 3rd, 1939, the committee issued a report to Congress.
We conclude that a rather large number of employees of the project are either members of the Communist Party or sympathizers with the Communist Party.
6 months away, on June 30th, the fiscal year would end, and next year's federal budget would be determined. The next time Congress would look into the federal theater, the subject wouldn't be the project's reputation. It would be funding. In February 1939, at the Golden Gate International Exposition, Hallie proudly opened the Federal Theater's one and only permanent theater building on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. The theater's new electronic lighting system, a forerunner of today's modern boards, was designed by George Eisenhower.
We opened on the day and hour schedule. A concert by the Federal Music Project in the outdoor court. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in the Marionette Theater. Run Little Chillin blazing across the stage in the big theater. Myra Kinch and her dancers performing American Exodus to such effect that we immediately lost several of our dancers to movie scouts.
But Congress, alas, does not sit in San Francisco. And in Washington, D.C., the theater talk was not so festive. Virginia Congressman Clifton A. Woodrum, chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations and staunch anti-New Deal Democrat, presenting for debate a bill to fund the WPA, explained why it included no funds for the Federal Theater.
It has produced nothing of merit so far as national productions are concerned. Every theatrical critic of any note expressed his disapproval of projects of this type. Now, I have here the manuscript for Sing for Your Supper. If there is a line in it, or a passage in it that contributes to the cultural and educational benefit of America, I will eat the whole manuscript. It has been a complete flop, and it cost over $300,000 to produce. So we are going out of the theater business.
Hallie knew what she had to do, but first she needed the blessing of her friend Harry Hopkins. Hopkins' advice was, it's your baby, fight for it.
We focused all the resources of our small office staff on just one thing, getting accurate information to members of Congress who wanted to help us.
Supporters flooded the House with letters and telegrams, but by a vote of 373 to 21, the Woodrum Appropriations Bill was passed.
When it became clear that the Federal Theater really might be abolished, there was absolutely a magnificent rally, an effort to save it. All of the unions who had had difficulties, the whole commercial theater, everybody at that point, just a sort of who's who in the theater world, rallied to save it. And Tallulah Bankhead, who was a very prominent actress at the time and the niece of a very powerful senator, came down and made this dramatic, eloquent plea before Congress to save the Federal Theater.
By a vote of 54 to 9, the Senate restored funding for the Federal Theater. But wait, to the Senator's astonishment, the congressmen were adamant. And in the end, to save the entire WPA funding, the Senate gave in. The adjusted bill forbidding the allocation of any money to theater projects went to the president for his signature. Roosevelt protested, saying that
This singles out a special group of professional people for a denial of work in their profession. It is discrimination of the worst type.
Roosevelt was in a bind, too, because the signs of war in Europe were very ominous. The international scene was so severe, or worsening to the point where he simply was not going to take them on an issue that ultimately affected relatively few people. The people who would have supported him domestically in terms of expanding the New Deal were isolationists. The people who would support him internationally were flat out opposed to any further extension and really willing to do anything they could to take down the New Deal.
So, a reluctant Roosevelt signed. And on June 30th, 1939, the Federal Theater received its death blow. Federal Theater productions running that night included The Swing Mikado, Life and Death of an American, and over at the Adelphi, Sing for Your Supper, which had finally opened. At the end of the Papa's Got a Job number, the show halted momentarily, so the actors could explain that after tonight, Papa would not have the job. And Yasha Frank wrote a new ending for Pinocchio. A voice from backstage cried, "Pinocchio is dead." In the house, actors called to the stage, "Who killed Pinocchio?" And the voice read off the names of all the congressmen who had voted against the Federal Theater project. Then the dead puppet was carried out onto the stage in a pine coffin, which bore the legend, "Born December 23rd, 1935, killed by act of Congress, June 30th, 1939. Crew members began to knock down the sets as the coffin was carried up the theater aisle and out the door, with cast and audience following in procession. They marched to Father Duffy Square, where the group made speeches, sang Auld Lang Syne, and dispersed slowly into the night. Hallie returned to Vassar. In the days that followed, she was flooded with messages of regret and comfort. One of them pulled her up short.
A telephone call came in from a congressman. He wanted to talk about the theater project in his state. But Congressman, there is no federal theater. You voted it out of existence. A stunned silence, then, what? It was abolished on June 30th by act of Congress. A shocked and heavy voice said, "Was that the Federal Theater?"
So, who killed the Federal Theater? Well, that hardly seems a mystery anymore. Martin dies and the anti-New Deal Congress. Sure, but what about Harry Hopkins, with his promise of a free, adult, uncensored theater? Or the politically naive Hallie Flanagan? And President Franklin Roosevelt, sandwiched politically between an oncoming war and a Great Depression? Or the WPA bureaucrats, the unions, the artists who co-opted the Federal Theater to promote their own agenda? So who killed the Federal Theater? They all did. But perhaps more important than who killed the Federal Theater is, what was its lasting legacy?
The Federal Theater project actually, with hindsight, was a most extraordinary phenomenon in American cultural history. It had no precedent, and it has had no successor. I think, much to the detriment of American theater.
If it had been allowed to continue, it would have developed into a nationally subsidized permanent theater, which would have been even more brilliant than it was.
And instead of this peanut stand that we run here on the 5 blocks on Broadway, which makes multimillionaires out of a handful of people, we could have some kind of a real engagement with the society in the theater, and that would be great.
There was this unbelievable kind of resurgence of artistic energy in America, especially from black artists.
To me, the legacy is very simple. It proved that there is a hunger for good, alive, pertinent theater in this country, no matter where it's performed.
This program has been made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Who Killed the Federal Theater is available on VHS for $19.95 or DVD for $24.95.